Welcome to the second lesson in our fourth unit on the presidency. Today is topic 4.2, presidential powers. So our goal today is for you to be able to describe how presidents use the powers that are given to them by the Constitution. As usual, please make sure you're filling in the blanks and following along on the note sheet that's been provided to you on the Google Classroom. So at first glance, when kids find out that the president cannot make laws and is not just all-powerful, doing whatever they want whenever they want, they think the president is actually pretty weak. But in reality, there's a lot they can do with the powers that they are given by the Constitution. So let's first look at the foreign powers the president has. That is, the powers the president has to act outside the country. First off, there's the treaty power. The Constitution grants presidents the sole ability to make deals with other countries. We call these deals treaties. Treaties are powerful because they're held as equal to the U.S. Constitution as the highest law in the land when they're challenged in court. What this means is that no law made by either a state or the federal government can violate an agreement made by a treaty. Some of these treaties promise lower taxes on items made in other countries. One example of this is NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement from the early 90s. It created what we call a free trade zone between the US, Mexico, and Canada, essentially meaning anything that's made in Mexico, the United States, or Canada can cross from one country to the other and would not be taxed by the country that the item is coming into. This allows for more resources to be traded across these three countries to more closely interconnect those economies. Now, it's important to note that NAFTA was repealed and replaced with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement by President Trump during his first term. But the idea is the same, essentially promoting trade between the countries by getting all three countries to promise by law they would lower taxes on items shipped to your country from one of those other two countries. Other treaties promise that the member countries will use natural resources in a very specific way. So, for instance, there is an international treaty signed on to almost every country in the world that are called the Agreement Governing the Activities of States on the Moon and Other Celestial Bodies. This agreement says that no member country will claim ownership or put a military presence on the moon or any other planet in the solar system. Similarly, the Antarctic Treaty is an international treaty among all member countries that agree that no country will claim ownership or militarize Antarctica. The idea here is that the moon, the planets, and Antarctica are all there for the joint ownership and use of everyone, not just one single country. This is designed to avoid military conflict between different countries when it comes to space exploration and Antarctica. Other treaties are military treaties, so they promise military protection. NATO is a great example of this. NATO is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's a defense pact between all the countries in blue here that say that if one of these countries is attacked by someone else, every other country in the treaty will declare war on the aggressing country. The idea being we're stronger together, we have allies that will help each other out, so no one country will be left to fend for themselves. Right now, NATO is the strongest military alliance the world has ever known, and the United States is the leader of this alliance. We can't tell the other countries what to do, but we're pretty much the biggest guys on the block. Other treaties promise a trade between the members of the treaty. So, for instance, in 1837, there was a treaty between the United States government and the Ojibwe tribe. You'll notice the Ojibways, their territory was much of what is now northern Wisconsin. So there had been a series of war between the United States and the Ojibwe. In 1837, the United States and the Ojibwe tribes signed a treaty where the Ojibwe would give the United States control of most of northern Wisconsin. In exchange, the United States would give the Ojibwe people money and resources as compensation. And then there was also a part of the treaty where there was a promise where the Ojibwe people would be allowed to hunt, fish, and gather wild rice on the lands they had given up. And this means that laws prohibiting people to hunt, fish, or gather wild resources in this area of Wisconsin that applies to everyone else in the state does not apply to members of the Ojibwe tribe because of the 1837 treaty between the United States and the Ojibwe people. Now, there are limits to the presidential power to make treaties with other countries. For instance, the president can make the treaty, but the Senate has to approve this. Remember, the Congress is made up of a House of Representatives and a Senate. There are two chambers. The Senate has the authority to approve any treaty negotiated by the president. What this means is that while the president gets to make the deal, it doesn't go into effect until the Senate approves it. This is like making a deal with your best friend, but you can't actually go and do the thing until you go home and ask your mom for permission. In this case, you would be the president, and your mom is the Senate. They have to approve of any deal you made first. To get around this, presidents sometimes use what's called an executive agreement. These are deals with other countries that are similar to treaties, but they're not held as equal to the Constitution as the highest law of the land. This is because they're essentially just a promise between the leaders of two countries that they'll use their executive authority in a way that allows them to carry out some common goal. But it doesn't actually affect the laws of the member countries. Confusing, I know, so let me give you an example. In 1907, there was something called the Gentleman's Agreement between the United States and the nation-state of Japan. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, Japan had a lot of people migrating to the United States on our west coast. This is also a period of intense racism in the United States. People on the west coast of the United States weren't happy with the number of Japanese immigrants coming to our shores. They also passed a lot of laws segregating their schools, not allowing Japanese people to go to the same schools as white people. Now, this unfair treatment of Japanese citizens residing in the United States, or people of Japanese descent residing in the United States, rightfully upset the leader of Japan. So, the president of the United States at the time signed an executive agreement with the leader of Japan. This agreement said that the leader of Japan would use his power to deny passports to Japanese citizens trying to come to the United States. That is, he would use his power to stop Japanese people from migrating into the United States by denying them a passport. In exchange, the president of the United States would work with the city of San Francisco and try to get them to stop segregating schools so that Japanese students could go to the same schools as white students. Essentially, if they didn't desegregate, you still couldn't sue because it wouldn't hold up in court because of executive agreements can't be enforced this way. Instead, it's just a promise between the two leaders to do their best to achieve this goal. You might be thinking, well, then can't you just make these agreements and break them? Well, yes, but if you do that, then who's going to make a deal with you in the future, right? It's all based on trust. So presidents, when they make these deals, they have to think about the long-term reputation of the United States to make sure they're not making deals and breaking deals, because otherwise no one's going to work with us. A more recent example of this was in 2016, when countries around the world were trying to get a hold of climate change, as we still are today. President Obama knew that the Republican-controlled Senate would not approve any treaty that he signed on to. So instead, he created an executive agreement which said that he would use his executive authority to do everything he could to try to bring down greenhouse gases within the United States. Now, the president has a lot of domestic power where he can help try to influence things to make this happen. Again, the goal here was to stop the worst consequences of climate change from happening. However, then in 2017, when President Trump became president, he removed us from the Paris Agreement with an executive order. Then in 2021, when President Biden became president, he put us back into the Paris Agreement using a different executive order. And then in 2025, President Trump became president again and once again removed us from the Paris Agreement. There are limits on this power. For instance, executive agreements can be overturned by the next president or congressional action, right? So we saw this, as I said, happening with the Paris Agreement, where President Obama made an executive agreement, President Trump removed us from the executive agreement, Biden put us back, and Trump took us back out again. So the next president can just cancel out any executive agreement. Presidents cannot do that for treaties. Congressional actions can also, so Congress can also pass a law that also undoes the executive agreement. They also do not hold the same weight in courts. That is, you can't sue or challenge a law saying it violates an executive agreement the same way you could do a treaty. It's also harder to use an executive agreement because, well, they're limited to the powers that the president does have domestically within the country, whereas treaties don't have as many limits to them. So presidents would prefer a treaty, but if they can't get one through the Senate, then they'll settle for a weaker executive agreement. Presidents also have appointment powers. So one of their foreign powers is the ability to pick ambassadors to other countries and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that is, the top military advisors. Ambassadors represent the U.S. and our interests in other countries, so their job is to help negotiate treaties and act as a direct communication between the president and the leader of a foreign country. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the highest-ranking military in the United States and the top military advisor to the president. So you can see these positions are key to helping the president using his foreign powers in his interactions with other countries. There are, like treaties, limits on this power. All appointments of this sort must be approved by the U.S. Senate. So again, the president can promise someone a job, but the Senate must approve the person getting the job. So this is, again, like you, if you're the president, promising your friend a job, but then you have to go to your mom and ask her for permission. You're the president, now your mom is the Senate. Another foreign power of the president is that they are the commander-in-chief. This means they're in charge of all the armed forces of the United States. As commander-in-chief, the president is in charge of all soldiers in the United States in all branches and get the final word on all military strategy. They also have sole authority over the U.S.'s nuclear arsenal and can decide to use them without any approval from the other branches. This means the president, if he wishes, can launch nuclear weapons at any point on the planet whenever they want. Now, there are limits to the president's ability to use the military. So, for instance, they are not allowed to use it inside the United States unless it's to defend from foreign invasion, except where allowed by the Insurrection Act, which we'll get to. Another limit was placed on the president's use of the military with the War Powers Act of 1973. In this law, it says the presidents must report the use of our military in another country to Congress within 48 hours. Basically, what this means is that the president's free to use the military to attack another country or to go use a military operation somewhere else in the world, but they got to tell Congress they did it within 48 hours of launching the attack. Then, Congress has 60 days to decide whether or not to approve that action. If they do not give the president approval within 60 days, then the troops have to return home. Now, presidents have historically refused to acknowledge this law as legal, but they voluntarily follow it. And the U.S. Supreme Court has never actually ruled if it's constitutional or not. For my money, it probably is not constitutional, as it is Congress passing a law to limit the president's power of commander-in-chief, which is a power given to him by the Constitution. So in order to limit that power, you'd have to change the Constitution, which you can't just do by passing a law. There's a whole amendment process you'd have to go through. Congress also has the power of the purse, if you remember. This means they're in charge of all spending. So while the president can order troops around, the military is funded and paid for by authorization from Congress. And Congress can cut off the funding whenever they want. They also are in control of military promotions. This keeps the member leaders of the military loyal to Congress and not just the president. So now that you know what the president can do outside the country, let's look at his domestic powers. That is, the powers he has to use within the country's borders. So the president does have some legislative power. Now remember, legislative power is the power to create laws. So while the president cannot create laws, he can veto bills passed by Congress. That is, Congress passes a bill, the president has the ability to say no and stop it from becoming a law. They also have what's called the agenda-setting power. What this means is that the president is really the one the news really pays attention to the most in our government. So presidents will use their media attention that they get to call Congress's attention to issues to kind of force them to act on something the president thinks is important. Because if the news is talking about it, well, then people will start caring about it. It's an indirect way of getting Congress to act. Now, there are limits on this. For instance, the president can veto a bill, but as we learned in a previous unit, Congress can override that veto and still make it a law if they can get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to vote to override it. Also, if the president refuses to veto it or sign it within 10 days of getting it from Congress, it becomes a law even if he doesn't want it to be one. And as far as agenda-setting powers, well, Congress is free to completely ignore the president if they want when it comes to what types of laws they're going to pass. So the president can't really just boss Congress around. That's not how it works. Just like the president has the appointment power as a foreign power, he also has it as a domestic power. They get to pick the leaders of executive departments. The jobs of these leaders is to report back to the president about the different areas of the government that they run and carry out the president's orders. For instance, the president gets to pick the head of the FBI, the CIA, he gets to pick the head of the Treasury Department, he gets to pick the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. But there's also a limit to this, because all appointments must again be approved by the U.S. Senate. The president can offer you a job, but the Senate has to approve. Then there's the executive power. Presidents are in charge of the executive departments, which is a massive bureaucracy. And the president tells them how to apply the laws passed by Congress. This is done through using something called executive orders. Executive orders are directions the president gives the heads of the executive departments and all executive employees. They carry the force of law, which means that the people in the executive branch must follow the order issued by the president as long as it is lawful. These executive orders are basically the president telling members of the executive branch, here's how I want you to carry out the law passed by Congress. For example, after Pearl Harbor, Congress passed a law declaring war on the Japanese Empire. As a result, to help carry out that war, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. This order told the military to remove all people of Japanese ancestry, including Americans who just have Japanese ancestry, to have them removed away from the west coast of the United States and put into a concentration camp until the end of World War II. Congress did not pass a law declaring these people must be put in concentration camps. Instead, it was a decision President Roosevelt took to help carry out the war efforts that Congress had declared. In the 1940s, President Eisenhower issued Executive Order 9981, which ordered the military to be desegregated. So Congress did not require the military to desegregate. Instead, that was a decision made by the president as commander-in-chief to order his military officers to integrate all troops. The most famous executive order is probably the Emancipation Proclamation, which ordered the freedom of enslaved Africans in states rebelling against the U.S. during the Civil War. Famously, this is celebrated on Juneteenth Day every year. Congress had ordered the president to fight the Civil War and bring the South back into the Union. As a result, President Lincoln issued an executive order saying that any state that is in open rebellion against the United States would no longer be allowed to keep control of enslaved populations. This, in effect, banned slavery in all southern states that were in rebellion. President Roosevelt also issued Executive Order 8807, which ordered military funding to be used to research the atomic bomb. Congress did not authorize this. Instead, Congress authorized spending on the war efforts, and President Roosevelt used an executive order to say some of that funding should be directed toward the research and construction of the first atomic warheads. Executive Order 10450 banned anyone who identified as LGBTQ+ from working for the federal government. Executive Order 10730 ordered the military to protect students who were trying to integrate schools in Little Rock. So you see, executive orders can be used for a wide range of things. In fact, in 2025, as I'm recording this, the current president is in the process of issuing a slew of executive orders on a wide range of things. Another domestic power presidents have is called executive privilege. This allows presidents to withhold certain information from Congress and the public, essentially allows the president to keep certain things secret. Usually this is reserved for the advice received from advisors and staff to ensure they're open and honest, even if they're giving an unpopular opinion. The idea here is that if the president needs to hear something unpopular, you need a staffer who's willing to say it, even if it could make them look bad if it got out to the public that they were the one who said it. So any advice given to the president is generally seen as falling under executive privilege. The president doesn't have to tell you who told him that, and these people don't have to tell Congress what they told the president to do or what their advice was. Then there's the president's pardon power, where they can grant forgiveness to people convicted of violating federal laws. This only applies to federal laws and not state laws, so it's yet again another example of federalism in action. Now, there are two different types of the pardon power. There is the pardon itself, which is forgiveness for a crime and ends all punishment. It also wipes the crime off your criminal record as if it never happened. Some presidents have used this power in order to prevent punishment in the future for a crime that was committed. For example, President Biden, in his last days of office, used his pardon power to grant forgiveness to his son, who was convicted of owning and possessing a firearm while currently using drugs, which is a violation of federal law. Upon returning to office, President Trump used the same pardon power in order to grant forgiveness to all the people who were charged with illegally entering the Capitol building and trying to stop the confirmation of President Biden's election in 2020, including individuals who were convicted of attacking police officers who were defending the Capitol building that day. A second power associated with the pardon power is the commutation power, which is a check on the judicial branch. Essentially what it can do is it doesn't forgive the crime, but it can shorten your punishment, even if it doesn't necessarily end the punishment right away. So for example, a commutation can be used to turn a 20-year sentence into a 20-year probation sentence. Famously, in his last days of office, President Biden used this commutation power to take about 37 people who are on death row in federal prisons awaiting to be executed, and instead of pardoning them, he commuted their sentences, turning their death sentences into life in prison sentences. So, changed or lessened the punishment because he was morally against the death penalty. Another domestic power that presidents have is the power to declare national emergencies. So, in a time of national crisis, presidents can declare what they call a national emergency according to congressional law. This allows the president to use special emergency powers they normally can't use. Some of these include the ability to suspend certain civil liberties. The idea is it's a short-term limited crisis that the president needs extra powers in order to solve to bring back peace and stability to the country. This is kind of similar to how the Romans did it when they had consuls during a time of crisis. They could elevate one of the consuls to a dictator-type position in order to solve the crisis and give the power back. The national emergency power is nowhere near that powerful, but it still has a lot of quirks that can be dangerous in the wrong hands. An example of this was during the Civil War. The Constitution guarantees everyone in this country a trial before they're punished by the government. However, it was not practical during the Civil War for the Union soldiers to be trying to capture Confederate soldiers and put them on trial, while the Confederate soldiers were shooting to kill. So the President of the United States at the time, Abraham Lincoln, used his emergency powers to suspend the right of habeas corpus, that is, the right to have your case heard before a judge. Now, the suspension of civil liberties is a very, very serious thing, and the courts generally watch this very, very closely. So presidents don't generally suspend civil liberties when there's a national emergency, but there has been occasions, like in the Civil War, where it has happened. So it's not inconceivable to think that sometime in the future, another president might use a national emergency to also suspend civil liberties when they feel it is necessary to get America out of a specific crisis. That thought should be pretty scary to you, actually, if you stop and think about it. National emergencies also allow presidents to get access to special money that Congress has set aside for use during only emergency situations. You remember, the president cannot control money, right? The money is controlled by Congress. What it gets spent on, how it gets spent, how much gets spent, all that is decided by Congress, not the president. During a time of national emergency, Congress has a separate set of money set aside that the president can then access in order to solve the crisis that we're facing. National emergencies also allow the president to ignore some laws, such as regulations for environmental purposes, in order to speed up response time. Now, if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, wow, that's a lot of power we're handing over to the president, and especially when the president can declare a national emergency. There are limits to this power, however. So, for instance, Congress can end a declaration of national emergency by passing a statement through both the House and the Senate that says the emergency is over. So while the president can declare an emergency, the House and the Senate can literally get together 10 minutes later and vote and say, nope, there's no longer an emergency, and those emergency powers go away. By now, you're probably realizing that presidents have an immense amount of power. Maybe not the same power you thought they had, but they still have quite a bit of power. Now, the founders had a fundamental idea here that if you give someone a little bit of power, they're going to always want more. And we've given the president quite a bit of power here, so what stops them from becoming a king or a dictator? So let's take a look at some of the limits put into place to stop this from happening. First off, there are all the limits we already mentioned earlier in this lesson that limits the way the president can use the powers they're given, especially extraordinary powers like those of a national emergency. But there are also legislative checks on the president, right? Congress has the power of oversight. This means they can investigate the president's actions to see how he's using his power and making sure he's not abusing it. This is done through committee investigations, where members of Congress in their committee will use their subpoena power to force members of the executive branch or other people in the country to come to Congress and testify about what's going on in order to keep an eye on what's happening with the executive branch. If Congress doesn't like what's happening, Congress also controls the federal budget. That means they control what money is spent on. If they don't like what the president's doing or how the executive branch is acting, they can cut back funding to different agencies that the president is using in order to stop them from doing whatever Congress doesn't want the president doing. And finally, if the president goes too far, Congress does have the power to impeach and remove a president that's abusive. It can be difficult to abuse your power when Congress is always looking over your shoulder, dangling your budget in front of you, and has the power to literally fire you if you do things they don't like. So this is the way that Congress can keep a check on the president to make sure they don't become too abusive of our rights. The judicial branch, or the courts, also have checks on the president's power. They have their own ways of stopping the president from becoming abusive. For instance, the Supreme Court can declare any actions of the president unconstitutional. What this means is that whatever that act of the president is that was declared unconstitutional can no longer continue to happen, and the president has to stop. You might ask, what happens if they don't stop? Well, that can happen, and that's a dangerous moment because then you have a president outright defying what the Supreme Court is saying. Theoretically, what could happen here is Congress would step in and force the president to act by either impeaching and removing him for violating an order from the Supreme Court, or by cutting off funding to the president's activity that the courts have declared unconstitutional. Now you might be thinking, what if Congress likes what the president is doing? And then you have the president and Congress teaming up against the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court really doesn't have any ways to enforce its own decisions. It relies on the president and Congress to basically enforce those decisions for them, which makes them the weakest of the branches. Has this ever happened before? The answer is yes. In the early 1800s, President Andrew Jackson, yes, the guy on your $20 bill, was trying to remove Native Americans, a Cherokee tribe, from their land in Georgia in violation of a treaty with them. This went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court told the president he could not kick the Cherokee off their land. President Jackson said that's the court's decision, let them enforce it, and then the president used his power as commander-in-chief to march the military onto Cherokee lands, kick them all off their lands, march them hundreds of miles across the country to Oklahoma, where thousands of them died along the way. This is known as the Trail of Tears. In this instance, Congress took no action really against the president, or no serious action against the president to stop him or punish him for this action, as the court's order was completely ignored. Could this happen again? Well, that's one of the concerns many people have right now in 2025, that President Trump is taking many executive order actions that may be in violation of the Constitution. The Supreme Court will probably hear these cases, and then it's going to be a question of, will President Trump follow what the Supreme Court orders, or will he pull an Andrew Jackson and completely ignore it, thus weakening the power of the judicial branch and that check on presidential power? We just kind of have to wait to see what happens. There are also electoral checks against the president, though. Voters can refuse to re-elect the president. If they don't like what he's doing, when the next presidential election comes up, voters can actively just choose someone else, right? That is the power of popular sovereignty. Ultimately, we the people get to decide who gets to use the executive power. If we like what they're doing, we let them keep the power. If we don't, well, then we give it to someone else. Now, originally there were no term limits. Today, with the 22nd Amendment, presidents can only be elected twice. But before the 22nd Amendment, you could be elected as many times as you want. President Roosevelt famously was elected 4 times. However, we felt it was dangerous to allow someone to be continually re-elected president. The founders even said, if you have a person who has all the power, whether they take it by force or even elected, it doesn't matter. They can still be a tyrant. So that's why we added the 22nd Amendment in the 1950s that says that presidents can only be elected twice and can only serve for a maximum of 10 years. Now, if you're astute and you're paying attention, you might be thinking the math really doesn't add up here. How can a president serve for 10 years when they can only be elected to 2 4-year terms? Well, that's because they can be elected for those 2 4-year terms. That's a total of 8. But if they were the vice president before they became president, and the president died, they would be able to serve out the final 2 years of that president's term as the acting president, and then still be elected 2 more times themselves for a total of 10 years. Well, what if the president died in their first year? Well, then the vice president would serve out the final 3 years and would only be able to be elected once for an additional 4 years, giving them a maximum of 7, right? So it really just says you can't be president for more than 10 years. We just think that's bad for the country. That's why we limited presidents to 10 years with the 22nd Amendment. There is also criminal prosecution. Our country is based on the rule of law, which means no one's above it. If you break the law, you will be punished, even the president. At least that used to be the case until this summer of 2024, when the Supreme Court issued a decision in a case called Trump v. United States, where the Supreme Court ruled that presidents are immune from criminal prosecution for any official acts taken as president. Effectively, the Supreme Court said that if you're president of the United States and you're using one of your legitimate powers as president, but you use it to commit a crime, you cannot be held responsible for that crime because you're acting as president using the powers of the presidency, thus putting the president above the law in many cases. There are many legal scholars who are worried about the precedent this case set. The fear of these legal scholars is that this court case will give presidents the excuse to commit abuses previously checked by assumed restraints. That is, presidents may do things that they wouldn't have in the past because they were afraid they may have been held criminally responsible for those acts. For instance, as commander-in-chief, could the president order the invasion of a foreign country and commit genocide against a minority religious group and then not be held criminally responsible for that because he was acting as commander-in-chief, which is a legitimate power of the president? Could he order the military to commit major war crimes and torture against the civilian population in an enemy nation during an armed conflict? After all, he's acting as president, so that's a legitimate power. Does that mean he can use that to commit war crimes? Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor warned that the ruling will have disastrous consequences for the presidency and for our democracy, and that sends the message that the president can violate the law and let him exploit the trappings of his office for personal gain and let him use official power for evil ends. Essentially, Justice Sotomayor on the Supreme Court said that this decision gives the president an excuse to break the law and to put themselves above the law to benefit themselves. She then added, even if these nightmare scenarios never play out, and I pray they never do, the damage has been done. The relationship between the president and the people he serves has shifted irrevocably. In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. So, Justice Sonia Sotomayor is one of these Supreme Court justices that voted against granting presidents immunity for any crimes they may commit in office while using their official powers. Unfortunately, she was only one of three. The other 6 said the president was immune. If you're wondering how this will affect the balance of powers between the 3 branches and checks and balances, that's something we're just going to have to wait to see how it plays out. One of the other Supreme Court justices who voted against this decision was named Ketanji Brown Jackson, and she warned that under the majority's new presidential accountability mode, a hypothetical president who admits to having ordered the assassinations of his political rivals or critics, or one who indisputably instigates an unsuccessful coup, has a fair shot of getting immunity, end quote. What Justice Brown Jackson is saying is that she believes the decision the Supreme Court made can be used by a president to justify the murder of a political rival who's running against them in an election, or by a president who wants to overthrow the government but fails at doing so. Can you charge them with a crime after the fact, after doing these things? Justice Brown Jackson thinks that based on the reading of the decision made by the Supreme Court, the answer is no, you cannot criminally hold those presidents responsible. No, of course, they can be held politically responsible by not being reelected in the next election or being impeached by the House of Representatives and removed by the Senate. Those political options are still on the table. In response to Justices Brown Jackson and Sotomayor, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts here, says that their opinions are just fear-mongering, arguing that they strike a tone of chilling doom that is wholly disproportionate to what the court actually does today. He wrote that, like everyone else, the president is subject to the prosecution in his unofficial capacity, end quote. So what Justice Jackson is saying is, yes, presidents are immune from being charged with a crime for anything they do as an official act of being president. That is, using their legitimate powers as president. He says this is not a big deal because presidents can still be held criminally responsible for anything they do as president that's not part of their official jobs. For example, under Chief Justice Roberts' explanation here, the president is criminally immune from any prosecution from using the military to invade, say, Canada, and then using the military to commit genocide against the Canadian people. The president cannot be charged with a crime for that genocide, because he's officially, by the Constitution, being given the power of commander-in-chief and was elected to use that power. So, any way he uses it in an official capacity, he cannot be charged with a crime for doing. However, if the president took a gun and just shot someone randomly on the street for no reason, that the president could still be held criminally responsible for. All right, we've come to the end of yet another lesson. Again, as always, at the bottom of your note sheet, make sure you're rewriting today's goal. If you can do it in your own words, great. Otherwise, just write it out word for word. Then again, write out 3 important facts from the notes that help you understand today's goal. Then finally, as always, write at least 1 question you still have that can help you better meet the learning goal today. All right, I'll see you in class.